I'll start off by talking about the syllabus quick. So on the back side, there's just the schedule of what we'd be covering. The plan right now is that the class would be 12 weeks long. That can probably be flexible depending upon, if there's a certain topic or class that we really want to dive more in depth on that we aren't planning to right now, we can probably change that and be a little flexible. And, so that's why put your email down if you want to be on the list for any changes and stuff. And then on the front, I just gave my little intro, and then there's 3 recommended reading books. Those aren't anything that I would say are required for the class whatsoever. But a lot of the content that we will be going through is captured a little differently in each of these books. There's kind of a one of them by it's called Know Why You Believe by Paul Little. I'd say that that's kind of the typical person's book if they're interested in apologetics. This is a nice overview of a lot of different stuff. There's another one called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, which has kind of a sassy title, by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek. That one's a little, I would say, slightly a step above in terms of going a little more in depth and being a little more comprehensive. And so if you want to go up the level in something that's slightly more nerdy in content, I would highly recommend that one. And then the last one, Talking with Your Kids About God by Natasha Crane. That book is actually, I would say, super helpful because in terms of some of these topics being kind of really heady and abstract, the best way to explain them to somebody is to picture how you would explain them to your children. And I think she actually does a really awesome job of handling a lot of apologetics type topics. There's definitely other stuff in there that's not super apologetics related, but a good portion of the book covers a lot of the topics that we would be covering in class. So I highly recommend any of those. The structure of the class isn't taken directly from these books or any books in general. It's kind of a combination of a lot of different sources, but yeah. So if you guys didn't grab syllabuses, are up here if you want a copy, take a look at them. So the goal of this class as a whole, as I mentioned in the syllabus, is to both equip us better to share the good news of the gospel, to pair apologetics with evangelism, with sharing the good news of Jesus, and secondly, also to be encouraged greatly in our own faith. There's nothing that gets me, more excited and more encouraged in my own faith is when I look at some of these things, such as like the arguments for the existence of God, which we'll be talking about a little later. When I think through those things and understand them really deeply myself, it encourages me so much that God's existence just makes sense, and it is just it's impossible for me to deny once I understand these things. So I'm excited for that aspect of the class also. And ultimately, we want to do it in a way that you guys can truly understand the important concepts for yourselves, rather than having to, take the word of people who have more academic credentials than you, or by memorizing a lot of anecdotal stories or scientific facts or anything like that, because I feel like typically that's what a lot of people think of when they think of apologetics, is they think of people with PhDs who understand apologetics way better than they do. And when you're discussing apologetics type topics with a non-believer, you can tend to think that the conversation can boil down to like, well, my scientist says this, and my PhD who's a Christian says this, but not actually really understanding the topics for yourselves. But I feel like even though some of these topics we'll be going through throughout the class seem very heady and abstract, I want to understand them for ourselves in a simple way that you can really engage in conversation with them rather than just understanding them. So I want to share a really quick, kind of apologetics success story a little bit that just happened to me literally like a week and a half ago. Hopefully encourage you guys a little bit. So I was at work talking to a coworker of mine who's a believer, and I was explaining to him that I would be teaching this apologetics class and that I was excited because apologetics is a topic that if I could pick any class in the world to teach, it would probably be an apologetics class. So it's kind of a dream come true to have this topic to be able to teach. And then another coworker of mine who's not a believer happened to walk by and sit down at his desk right by me, and he's like, "Oh, dream come true. What's a dream come true?" And then I had to it's a really awkward thing to explain. To like, "Oh, it's my dream come true that I'm going to be teaching a Sunday school class on defending the Christian faith." So I explained that to him, and basically he just started asking me questions, just like out of the blue. He's like, "Oh, really? Like, well, how would you do that?" I was like, "Oh, okay." So we had a really short conversation, and then basically at the end he said, he's like, "Well, yeah, I know I kind of grew up in the church, but then the reason that I walked away from the church is that I just couldn't believe all these things in the Bible, like Jonah being swallowed by a whale and being spit out 3 days later, and all these ridiculous things that are in the Bible, and then enacting just a simple apologetics concept of something that we'll talk about, say, like in class 9, the role of miracles in apologetics, where I said, those things that are recounted in the Bible as miraculous. I was like, that's kind of the point. I was like, the point is that they're not possible. But if we can say with a high degree of certainty that those things actually did happen, that are impossible, that's excellent evidence that the God who created the universe can reach in and break those laws that he instituted. And then he's just like, "Oh, never thought of it that way." And then I recommended a book to him that if you wanted to check out to read, I'd highly recommend. And then he said, "Okay, sure, I'll check it out." And I didn't know if that would actually happen. And I told him that I had the audiobook version if he wanted to take a listen to it. And he's like, "Okay, yeah, maybe I'll download it later." And then a couple days later, he actually said, "Oh, I tried to download it, but then I couldn't. Could I get the copy from you?" So he actually wanted it, and he's actually going to follow up on it. So that was super exciting. So that wasn't me like spitting off tons of scientific facts or anything. That was me just like explaining this simple concept to him, and that just totally changed the way that he thought about his Christian faith. So a big motivation for my level of interest in apologetics is due to A, I just love the topic, but B, I also have kind of the best friend that I grew up with, who was not a believer, and then shortly after I became a believer, he asked me about my faith, and while I was all jazzed about Christianity. Basically, he went on the road through a Bible study that I did at my house. He decided to become baptized and proclaim faith himself. And then about 2 years ago, he told me, I'm an atheist, and I just can't come to terms with all these things that I think contradict Christianity. And the big thing specifically for him that he was hung up on was evolution. I can't reconcile it. I feel like these are the facts, and the Bible doesn't line up with it, and I believe that there is no God. So that gave me an extra level of interest in the topic and wanting to understand apologetics better, because this guy that's been my closest friend for my whole life is suddenly telling me this, and I want to be able to have conversations with him. And so with that, I was just curious if anybody wants to share, like, what is your guys' motivation for wanting to take the class, or what motivation do any of you guys have for wanting to learn more about apologetics in general?
I just have something to say about the evolution thing. I really think that evolution is the first lie to take away the rest of the Bible's validity. And I have a friend my best friend from high school, atheist. She works at the linear accelerator at Stanford University with subatomic particles, and she says that evolution is a ridiculous theory for origins. There is a natural explanation, she says, we just haven't figured it out yet. So somebody who's worked with subatomic particles sees how ridiculous it is.
And evolution is a topic that we'll cover when we cover the teleological argument, which is the argument from design. We'll talk about how do we handle the topic of evolution, and even if evolution is scientifically plausible, does that therefore invalidate Christianity? And so on. Does anybody have any strong motivations they want to share, or just general interest?
I just think that there's so many things in our lives that are actively trying to discourage us in our faith.
Okay, well, with that, I want to do a quick kind of overview of each of the topics that we're planning on going through, so that you can kind of get the overarching argument of the class and understanding how it all pieces together. So the class as a whole will, go through all these different topics that are listed on the syllabus, and each of them are a topic unto themselves. Of if you only were to go to that class, you would at least be much better equipped to understand that topic. But they fit together in kind of a very general argument of how to defend the Christian faith. So today we're covering the overview and how and why and what is apologetics. After that, in the second class, we're going to talk about worldview and apologetics approaches. So when we talk about worldview, we'll talk about what is a worldview, how does it affect the way that you see the world, how do you determine what is a good worldview and what is a bad worldview. What are the tests to understand that and see how it affects how you interpret truth. And then types of apologetic approaches. Believe it or not, even within the Christian faith, how do we defend the Christian faith is not something we all agree on. So even people that say a church like Jubilee, typical people that we would often look up to, even they have disagreements. So for instance, like somebody like Tim Keller, who's very the presuppositional apologetics, versus a guy like R.C. Sproul, they actually approach apologetics somewhat differently. And so I want to understand what are the different ways, and not necessarily say that a specific way is the best, but understand why they do the way that they do it. And the class will kind of ultimately cover all of the approaches, if that makes sense. But and then after that, we'll talk about the laws of logic, nature of truth and reality, which they kind of go together, and then addressing postmodernism and pluralism. So those sound like, at least like understanding the laws of logic and then the nature of truth and reality sounds like a super heady philosophy 101 type of topic. But when we understand those, and we'll go through them in a nice formal way, don't worry, there's only 3 laws, it helps us to understand, especially when we go through the arguments of God, understanding those really simply helps us to identify clear contradictions in, like say, the atheist worldview or other people's worldviews, where we can very clearly say something is right or something is wrong, with a lot more confidence. And then postmodern and pluralism, that's kind of the ground level base point of you have to tackle that before you can do anything else. Because if somebody doesn't even believe that there is such a thing as truth, there's no point in, you can't prove to them what the truth is if they just at the beginning say, well, I don't believe in absolute truth, and that's true to you, but that's not true for me. So we're going to address postmodernism and pluralism, which super infiltrates, say, my generation or millennials, and it might be going away slightly, but a good portion of people my age would say that. They would say, well, that's true for you, but that's not true for me, and so there's no bother talking about it. After that, we'll talk about the different arguments for God, starting with the cosmological argument, then the teleological argument, and then the moral argument. So these are kind of the 3 kind of classic arguments for the existence of God that if you were to listen to Christian versus atheist debate, for example, these are typically the 3 beginning arguments that somebody will set forth to prove that God exists before they move on to other stuff. So the cosmological argument is the argument that God must exist due to the creation of the universe, the fact that the universe had a beginning, therefore he must have a beginner. That's the really simple version. So that personally is my favorite one, where through what we can learn through the cosmological argument, it has huge implications about the characteristics of this first cause, or this beginner, that we can get through simple philosophical ideas and modern day science, which has amazing correspondence with the attributes of God in the Bible. And that to me is probably, in terms of the arguments of God, that gets me the most excited. And then after that is the teleological argument, which is the argument from design, that the idea that because the universe has a design, there must be a designer. And that's going to be split up into a couple different parts of the design of everything, the universe, and then the design of life is kind of the other side of that, which is where we'll touch on the topic of evolution and how we handle that. And then after that is the moral argument, also the problem of evil and suffering. And so that class will kind of be broken up into a little half and half of why does the existence of evil and good prove that God must exist. That'll kind of be half the class. And the other half will be taught by Frank Schmidt, and he'll cover basically how do we handle the problem of evil and suffering biblically. So how does evil and suffering prove that God actually does exist? Kind of the brute force logical argument, but then on the flip side, how do we actually handle it as a Christian, and how should we talk to people about this topic biblically? Yeah. And so these different arguments, so I would say cosmological is the one that I get most excited about. The teleological argument from design. You guys know some prominent atheists, say Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens. So Christopher Hitchens, a famous atheist author and debater, he thinks that even though he's not persuaded, the teleological argument is the closest one that comes to persuading him. He thinks this is the most powerful argument that Christianity has. But then the moral argument is probably the one that honestly affects people the most, that kind of hits to home the most, where people have a very hard time denying the fact that there is objective evil. But as soon as they do that, they have to affirm that God exists. So each three of these has very different but awesome implications. And then after that, we'll switch into textual criticism, and after that, talk about historical accuracy, and supposed contradictions in the Bible. So textual criticism, has anybody heard of or read a book by Bart Ehrman called Misquoting Jesus? Or, have you read it?
I've read it.
Okay, yeah. So that was a book that was a huge bestseller for a long time, written by a guy named Bart Ehrman, who is trying to basically use this concept of textual criticism, the idea that, so textual criticism is piecing together what the correct words of the Bible are based off of all the manuscripts that we have. So all of the old manuscripts, handwritten copies that we have from the beginning, basically up until the printed manuscripts invented, essentially. Using all of those different manuscripts, we piece together what we can say with a high degree of confidence. This is what the original text said. But using facts about textual criticism, somebody like Bart Ehrman uses the concept to completely undermine the Christian faith, to say, basically, you can't have confidence in what your supposed Bible even originally said, let alone if the contents are even true. So that's a huge stumbling block for a lot of people. Say, for instance, one of those facts would be there's more variance between the different manuscripts. Basically, differences where one word differs from another manuscript. There's more variance than there are words in the New Testament. Which is true, but that's taken completely out of context, and we can see why that's the reason that is the case is actually something we can be really encouraged about. Okay, so then after that, once we can establish that we have with a high degree of confidence what the original text actually said, is it actually accurate? Is what it was recorded actually true history? Are there tons of contradictions in the Bible? and we'll probably specifically focus on the New Testament. But that would be something that a lot of people believe, that the Bible is supposedly riddled with contradictions that don't align with history, and internally, that the Bible doesn't agree with itself on what happened. That one author, the Gospel of Mark says one thing, and the Gospel of Luke says another thing, and they don't even get their story straight. So we'll talk about that. And then after that, we'll talk about the resurrection. And the reason for having an entire class on that is ultimately the entire Christian faith hinges on the resurrection, whether or not that's actually true. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul says, if Christ didn't rise from the dead, our faith is vain. Our faith is futile, and we're still in our sins. So if one can disprove that the resurrection happened, they can disprove all of Christianity. If Jesus actually didn't rise from the dead, if he's still in a bone box somewhere and never proved to be God, then Christianity is futile. But on the flip side, if we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Jesus really did rise from the dead, using historical facts, using non-Christian sources, etc., then that gives us huge confidence in the Christian faith, in the accuracy of the New Testament. And then the implications of that are huge, that, then Jesus truly is God, and if Jesus claimed that the Bible is the Word of God, then it really is, and we should believe it. So then after that, we'll talk about the uniqueness of Christ and the Trinity. And that class would be kind of taught from a standpoint of, amongst all the different supposed gods that are out there, what makes Jesus different and unique, and what makes the concept of triune God unique and different. And basically, once we see all the unique characteristics, that forces us to say, yes, we have to at least consider Jesus. We have to investigate Jesus deeper because he's so different, so unique amongst all the supposed gods. And then the last couple of classes, we'll talk about miscellaneous objections. So a couple of the main ones that I wanted to talk about would be the idea that basically the disciples made up the story of Jesus based off of similar pagan myths. That there are supposedly all sorts of Persian gods and Egyptian gods that have the exact same backstory as Jesus. I think that was one of the things I put on the syllabus. The god Mithras, a long time ago, he had all these things that he had 12 followers, and he supposedly rose from the dead 3 days after he died. And, he supposedly instituted a communal meal, and he was thought of as the way, the truth, and the life. Doesn't that clearly show that Jesus is just a mythological story, and they just made up all the same stuff, except we're the only ones that take it seriously? We'll talk about that. That's a common objection, and then another common and recent objection is the idea that there's a lot of recently discovered New Testament books that just weren't included. When I was talking about my coworker earlier, that was one of the things that he brought up. He's like, well, have you heard about all those other books that weren't found, but now we see them, and they just weren't included, and they should have been? We'll talk about that, and talk about the implications of, even if that were the case, does that prove that Jesus didn't rise from the dead? So we'll address specifically those books that have been found, and all the popular ones, and investigate whether or not they're valid. And then the last class, kind of a wrap-up class, / being flexible class, depending on what topics people want to cover. Of just kind of looking into, how come supposedly the U.S. Academy of Sciences, 95% of the members are atheists. Like, why is that the case, and how should we handle that? And how should we handle engaging those people with apologetics and engaging, our grandfather who dropped out of school in 3rd grade? How do we handle apologetics to everybody? So with that, is there specific topics that people really want to cover? Is there, or specific topics people really want to emphasize? is, say, for instance, evolution something we really want to talk about? Or Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, do people really want to talk about that? Is there anything, I guess, kind of burning that people hope to cover in the class? Yeah,
I just have a question.
Yeah.
For the fifth, it says the ontological argument. Are we covering that, or is that?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I missed it. So the ontological argument, along with those three arguments for the existence of God, the ontological argument is this idea that God can't not be. It's kind of the short way to say it. And the ontological argument is one that some really highfalutin philosophical people actually do really put a lot of faith in and emphasis on, but even I myself and almost everybody that I've ever interacted with, they don't really seem to feel like it holds much weight, but it's kind of one of the first arguments that have existed for trying to lay forth God must exist because this. So we'll probably touch on it, maybe, and it might be in that class, depending on kind of where we have room, but yeah. Anybody else? Is there like specific topics that people have a burning to look into?
Two of the objections I hear sometimes is like Christianity is intolerant.
Say it again?
Christianity is intolerant.
Okay.
And I don't like that about it. So how do you respond to somebody that has that objection? Christianity is intolerant.
Yeah.
Or just the whole idea of I'm a pretty good person. I don't need that. I don't need religion. I'm just being a good person, basically. How do you respond to that objection?
Mm-hmm.
Sort of thing.
Yep. Okay.
And then what I've heard throughout my life is, well, Christ can't be the only way to God.
Okay. It's like the idea of pluralism. Yeah. Okay.
Ricky, one of the things that I've found when I've talked with different types of people about a lot of these topics is often their objection is more truly emotional and moral, or moral. So like my grandfather, who was an atheist, we would start by talking about a lot of these things, which seemed to be the objection. But we had one particularly really good conversation late into the evening where he ended up in tears talking about the pain that had been caused him by Christians close to him early in life, and it seemed like it was a more fundamental objection than kind of these were surface level stumbling blocks. And so I look at all these topics as really good and helpful, as long as we kind of constantly remember that the people we're talking to are not simply intellectual heads. That might be the entrance point, and these have to be addressed, but there's always an emotional and maybe even a moral objection underlying probably most of them.
Yep.
So that's not to change anything. This is really good, but maybe if we all keep it in mind as we constantly go.
Yep. Yeah, we are all. This list seems very just purely intellectual and purely heady and purely focused on the mind, but obviously as humans we have a heart too, and our decision making, what we believe, has a lot to do with the heart, not just the head. Yeah.
And I would just share similarly, my brother, had a lot of talks with him, and kind of arguing, and I'm learning all these good things, and not really going anywhere, and he's not really arguing, and I don't know why. I thought it was like, is it that you don't believe, or that you don't care? And he basically said, I just don't care. Which is a different thing. So like, you're not going to win me over if I don't even care. So the prayer goes from, jiu-jitsu science to you pray that his heart will be changed.
Yeah.
And that's a much different path. And it was just, God gave me that question, and I was like,
Yeah, and that we can kind of look at that as almost an objection unto itself, apathy of, well, why should I care?
yeah, so where is this heart at? Then you can kind of know how, sort of what's behind the...
And the other thing that complicates everything is election. The election of God.
you want to expound on that a little bit?
Well, it's like I have a brother too that I'll talk to, and then I think, well, we're getting pretty old. Is he just not one of the elect?
Yeah, and that would be that theological doctrine of predestination or election is, depending on where you fall in Christianity, it is something that is a common objection to Christianity. How can you believe in that? And why does it matter whether or not I believe if God has predetermined whether or not I believe? Cool. Okay, so I just want to, after covering all those, so basically where these come together is these few classes are going to be kind of the foundations of the class. Or I'll reword it as truth can be known. And then the next section, arguments for uses of God, is God exists. And then the next couple classes would be third point in the argument. The New Testament is reliable. And then the rest of it would be mainly focused on this class. Fourth part of the argument. Jesus' resurrection proves it. So that's a super simplistic kind of skeleton of the argument. We actually can know things. We can know truth. Truth can be known, including truth about God. Next step, God exists. Next step after that, the New Testament is historically reliable. The New Testament says that Jesus rose from the dead. He actually did. Therefore, Jesus is God. Therefore, the Bible is the Word of God. We should trust it. That's kind of that would be the super simplistic argument that ultimately the class fits into. And each of the pieces are pretty important depending on who you're talking to. Depending on who you're talking to, they might be starting here. Other people might be starting here. But some people truly are starting here and saying, well, how can I know anything at all? How do I know if I even exist, let alone if God exists? But that's the base point of the ultimate skeptic. So we're going to do the full gamut. So each of the classes I hope to be really interactive and very conversational. But today I wanted to specifically look at 1 Peter 3:15. So you guys in your Bibles, you want to open up. We're going to look at 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 13 through 17. And if somebody pulls to that, does somebody want to volunteer to read that for us? Uh, 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 13 through 17.
I could read. Now who is there to harm you? You are zealous for what is good. But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with great gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil.
Thank you. So the first thing I want to talk about is who the audience of this passage is. So at the very beginning of 1 Peter, chapter 1, verse 1, it says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. So the message of this letter is addressed to all the elect exiles. It is not just addressed to the leaders, or for instance, just Timothy, or it's not just addressed to certain people, and it's definitely not just addressed to people with PhDs who go around giving lectures on college campuses, or people, say for instance, like me, who probably do fit somewhat of the stereotype of young nerdy men who have spare time to watch atheist versus Christian YouTube debates for fun. And it's not just addressed to those people. It's addressed to all of the exiles. It's addressed to the whole church, all Christians. And so within that, the elect exiles of the dispersion, these are people who had to scatter due to persecution. So this letter and this passage, where he says make a defense, is addressed to people who could be killed for giving that defense. And yet often we want to back down because we're afraid of giving defense because of how the person will react and what our reputation, what would happen to that, whether we'd be embarrassed. Yeah. So I want to cover what is apologetics, how do we do it, contained within this verse, and ultimately, the most important, why. So what is apologetics? The Greek word for defense in this passage, so in verse 15, always being prepared to make a defense, the Greek word is apologia. That's where we get our word for apologetics. You guys may have heard that before. But yeah, that's what apologetics is. It's defending the Christian faith. And what does that defense look like? Within the passage it says, making a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. So it's giving a reason for the hope that is in you. Or another way of saying it, it's showing that the hope that is in you is reasonable, which is what this class is going to aim to do. Or yet another way to look at it, and the other word I want to point out from the Greek is, the word for reason is the Greek word logos, where we get our word logic. So it's showing that the Christian faith is logical. It's reasonable. And that implies that the gospel is capable of being explained, that we have the ability to do it, and that it makes sense, and that we should believe it not simply because of the way it makes us feel, or that we want it to be true, or because somebody else told us that it was true, or even because the majority of people we know believe it is true, which is the case for a lot of young believers or young children. So we should believe something is true, basically, from this passage, because we actually believe it is true. I hope that makes sense. So, believe something is true because you actually believe it's true. We should have a good reason to believe it, which, yes, does include the testimony of the Holy Spirit. I'm not saying that is not a real thing. But I want to contrast that to an example of, I know several Mormon people, one who's a good friend and coworker of mine, and he and others that I have known would always point to the Holy Spirit bearing testimony in their own heart, and they refer to it as burning in the bosom. But they fully admittedly cannot appeal to actual evidence or historical evidence for believing, say, the Book of Mormon, or that Joseph Smith actually met God the Father. I'm not inventing words on their behalf. That's something that he, my coworker, would fully admit. But the power of the Holy Spirit bearing testimony in his own heart that the Book of Mormon is true is why he believes it. I would say that, we have very fickle hearts, and we will believe what we want to believe or feel pressure to believe. And that burning in the bosom, could be the bad pizza we ate a few hours before the altar call happened. But we should not base our beliefs in our eternity on what simply could be a feeling. So Peter here says that our Christian faith is reasonable and capable of being explained. With that in mind, when somebody asks you why you are a Christian, or trying to explain why you are one, be conscious that that's not necessarily the same thing as explaining how you became a Christian. If somebody asks you for your testimony, if you're explaining your testimony, it might involve, I met this guy who was super nice, and he started and he started talking to me about the Christian faith at a time when I was really lacking identity and so on, and we started getting coffee, and eventually at this time and this place, I became a Christian. That might all be true, very well so, and that might be how you became a Christian, but ultimately, why you are a Christian right now is not simply, or should not be simply that story of the series of events that took place. Why you are a Christian includes the reason for the hope that is in you. It is reasonable. What are the reasons that you have that faith? What are the reasons you still believe it? What are the reasons you continue to believe these things? Not just what changed your heart in the first place. So I just want to make that nuanced distinction. So another facet of what apologetics is that it's evangelistic in nature. That's not super explicit in this text, but I want to say, so how can we be successful in evangelism without giving reasons to believe the good news? And so the line between evangelism is over here, and apologetics is over here. It should intentionally be blurry between the two. If evangelism is sharing the good news of Jesus and wanting people to become a Christian, and apologetics is giving those reasons, you would say, well, yeah, that's what evangelism is. That's what sharing the good news is. It's, you're giving reasons why somebody should believe it. Exactly. The apologetics is not over here, and evangelism is over here. I think a good example of this is in Acts 26. Paul is standing before Agrippa, and he says, "King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today as I make my defense against all the accusations of the Jews." So he was being accused of causing chaos throughout Europe and perpetuating a religion that esteems Jesus as king, instead of Caesar, and so forth. But Paul's defense consists of explaining basically why he has good reason to believe what he does, and therefore act the way he does. And at the end, Agrippa says, "Do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to become a Christian?" So Paul is defending the truth of the Christian faith in this passage. If you look at it, he basically just kind of recounts some of his own testimony and the truth of why he believes what he does. And at the end, basically Agrippa gathers from it that he wants Agrippa to become a Christian. So inherently, apologetics is evangelistic. If that's not the end goal, to glorify God through the spreading of the good news, then apologetics is not powerful. It's not doing anything. So that's what I would say apologetic is based off of this passage. And how do we go about doing it? So right after it says to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, he says right away, yet do it with gentleness and respect. So out of curiosity, has anybody gotten one themselves or seen on social media or Facebook, for instance, an apologetics type debate where anybody's debating the existence of God or even debating like the facet of Christianity at all? I feel like those happen frequently. I've seen it. Yeah. I know I have engaged in some myself a long time ago. So out of curiosity, would the people that say you have at least seen one, would you characterize those conversations on social media as having gentleness and respect? Usually not. Yeah.
I remember one time in college, this guy was trying to explain the gospel. He was on top of a ladder, yelling down at everybody in the crowd, and everybody was yelling back at him. No gentleness, nothing that would convey the goodness of the gospel.
Yeah. So Peter, inherently he knows right away that if we're going to go about this defending the Christian faith and showing that it's reasonable, we instinctively will not be gentle and respectful. We will probably be harsh and defensive, and potentially angry as they get angry at us. So he specifically calls us to these two things. So in terms of gentleness, we often become harsh because we see other people's arguments as an attack personally on us rather than an attack on Jesus. If we truly view Jesus' glory being at stake here versus our own glory, we would be not so quick to be offended and defensive, because we would have more inclination to have Jesus' character while doing it. Similarly, for that matter, we'd be less inclined to make up facts that we're not actually really sure of, in order to make it seem like we don't know the answer to a question, or understanding a certain topic, because we're viewing our own glory of being at stake, not Jesus'. The other aspect that it touches on is respect. So I'd say the person that you're talking to is created in the image of God, and inherently has value, and therefore deserves our respect. You're talking to somebody who bears the image of God. They are not beneath you in any way, I think Peter is saying. The only reason that we have faith in Jesus, and the Holy Spirit is bearing witness in our own heart, and we're seeing the truth, is because God's sovereignty has allowed us to do that. We shouldn't be viewing ourselves as higher and mightier and of better understanding than them, because we're Christian and they're not, and therefore they're the ones that are stupid, and we are clearly more intellectually superior. That is not the case. So a little bit more information of how we do apologetics, I think, comes from the fact that in the passage, it talks about somebody asking us a question. Verse 15 says, make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. I think that this implies the questioning, a true conversation of a back and forth. Somebody's actually asking you a question. So you're not just talking at somebody. Apologetics should take place in normal conversations where you're talking to somebody, you're asking them questions, and they're asking you questions back. A lot of people, when they hear the word apologetics, like I said earlier, they think of somebody like Rabbi Zacharias, if you guys have heard of him, standing on a college campus, just giving a seminar, and just talking. At the end, he usually does a Q&A session. But while I do think he is being faithful to what apologetics is, I think, based off the context, being faithful to what apologetics is having normal conversations with other Christians, or other non-believers, sorry. Normal people, normal conversations. So we should be asking other people questions as well. I know that my inclination, if I have a good opportunity to share the gospel with somebody, and my wife can attest to this, who's sat next to me on airplanes and stuff while I'm sitting next to a random stranger that I had the opportunity to talk to, my temptation sometimes is, I have this person's attention for a limited amount of time, I'm going to try to cram in as much truth as I possibly can before it's too awkward and I know I should stop, versus actually talking to them and asking them questions, etc. But I think Peter's saying that that's not exactly how we should go about it. We should be asking them questions, and in a normal conversation, they would be asking them back. And I think Jesus was the prime example of this. In so many encounters throughout the Gospels, people come to Jesus with questions, and what does he do right away? So many times, first thing he says is he asks them a question back. Let's see if you guys think of the question he asked in a couple of these passages. This is Mark 12, 14 through 17. It says, and they came to him and said to him, Teacher, we know that you are true and do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not? But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, why put me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me look at it. And they brought one, and he said to them, you guys know what question he asked?
Whose image is on this?
Yeah. Whose image? Whose likeness in the scripture is this? Yeah. He immediately starts with it's a very simple question, but he's asking them questions. I guess maybe another good one. Matthew 16, 13 through 15. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He said to them, but who do you say that I am? Jesus simply could have said, I am the Christ. Instead, he started off with asking them, who do people say the Son of Man is? And then he said, well, who do you say that I am? He's getting them to think about it. He's getting them to search their own mind and search for what they think the truth is, versus just making a statement and then hoping that they take it in. And that, I think, has huge implications to how we do apologetics and how we evangelize. So I think most importantly out of all of this, and one of the most important things I want to gather from this kind of foundation class before we dive into the nitty-gritty topics is why do we do apologetics? If we look at the beginning of the verse, it says in verse 15, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense, and so on. So as the way the sentence flows, I believe giving a defense, showing that the Christian faith is reasonable, is the very thing that accomplishes honoring Christ as holy. I think this is huge. So honoring Christ, I would say, is equals glorifying God. Glorifying God is at the heart of apologetics. You wouldn't normally kind of pair giving a defense of the Christian faith as honoring Christ in your heart, but I think that's exactly what this passage says. When we gently and respectfully give a defense for the Christian faith, God is glorified because we are honoring Christ in our hearts as holy and worthy of devotion, even if the person we're talking to walks away thinking that we're an idiot. I think that's true. God is still glorified in that situation, even if that's the outcome. We're still honoring Jesus in our heart as holy and being worthy of what we're doing. So ultimately, the why also informs the how. So I'd say a summary of how not to do apologetics, based off of what we looked at. How do we not do apologetics? We do not do it rudely, impatiently, argumentatively, because we don't honor Jesus. We bring reproach on the name of Jesus by not displaying his character. We do not do apologetics by attempting to show how smart we are. Then we do not honor Jesus, we honor ourselves. And I've definitely been guilty of that in plenty of situations. We do not do apologetics by making up facts that we're not even really sure about because we don't know the answers to their questions. When we do that, we don't honor Jesus. We treat him as not being adequate or sufficient in having all the truth in himself. On the flip side, we do apologetics gently and respectfully, like Peter calls out. We do it by showing how amazing and glorious Jesus is, not ourselves. We do it by sticking to only the truths of Jesus, because he is sufficient and we don't have to change or add anything to him in order for him to be more reasonable. We might be tempted to skew biblical truth in order to make it appear more reasonable to the people that we're talking to. So I'd say these things honor Jesus as being holy and set apart and exalted and worthy of our praise. So I want to keep that kind of mindset throughout the whole class. So even when we're talking about something like the laws of logic, that's honoring Jesus in our hearts. That's honoring Christ as worthy in our hearts when we learn the laws of logic and we learn how to understand other people's worldview and understand our own worldview. And we can take learning about postmodernism, pluralism, and learning about the cosmological argument, we can let that be an act of worship by honoring Christ in our hearts. So, yeah. That's kind of what I wanted to gather from 1 Peter 2:15, that passage. And then all the following classes, I really hope that they're extremely interactive. I want us to really dive into these issues in depth.